A very good evening, everybody. I hope you've had a terrific weekend. I'm just admitting the final people entering this event. So you'll forgive me if I just pause for a second while I click in. But I'm delighted to welcome you to this really fascinating evening and introduce you to Piers Secunda, who is quite difficult to understand or to be quite clear as to how we describe Pierre, because he is I'm told there's a terrible echo in the auditorium. If that is that the case, can anybody else please confirm on the chat? My audio is okay. Now there is double audio, but from the same person. Joyce, I think it may just be your side because other people are telling me it's fine. So we will continue, and I hope Joyce you'll get that sorted out. The reason why I say it's difficult to describe Piers is because he's one of many different characters. First of all, he's an artist, he's a detective, he's a scholar and a historian, and he has a passion for culture, which I think is in its widest format is probably the best way that I could describe you, Piers. I mean, you will probably correct me, but you're somebody who cares deeply, not just about making culture, but about protecting culture. And I think that's been part of your life. So let's kick off by saying, please introduce yourself. Tell us who you are, where you came from. We won't ask your age, but what your education was and how you became and why you became an artist.
Yeah,
Piers.
thank you. A pleasure. And thank you very much, everybody who's tuned in to this conversation. Glad that you're here. I was born in London in 1976, and I grew up mostly in West Sussex. I spent most of my childhood drawing and painting. And by the time I was in my early teens, I decided that I wanted to be an artist. And I basically have never looked back. I went to Chelsea Art College in the 90s, graduated in 1998, studied painting, and then over the course of time, developed my painting practice. I was living in the United States in New York State, outside New York City, in the early 2000s, and saw on the television the destruction of the Bamiyan Buddhas by the Taliban in the summer of 2001. And then a few months later, 9/11 happened. And I found it very difficult to continue with an abstract painting practice because I couldn't focus my mind on effectively comparative aesthetics. So I started making work about geopolitics and specifically about why the destruction of culture happens, what it means in terms of where we are as a species, I suppose you could say, where our civilization has got to or hasn't. And I've been examining that at great length, 20 plus years, traveling to Afghanistan, traveling to Iraq, looking at what ISIS did in Iraq, great length. And over the course of time, become more interested in closer to home history related projects such as the occupation of Alderney, which is our subject matter of today.
We only have an hour, regrettably, rather than 4 hours or 4 days, which I suspect we could easily fill in a conversation. But before we move on to Alderney, just give us a brief outline in terms of your experiences in Afghanistan and Iraq.
Well, I started to travel to Afghanistan in 2009 and make work about what the Taliban were doing in Afghanistan. I made molds of damage that the Taliban had done to violent damage, shooting and explosions, to disassemble the culture of the country in order to enforce their way of life on it, which was really what I was interested in. When ISIS started tearing up the Middle East in 2014, I realized immediately that the scale, the industrial scale of the damage to history and the memory of ultimately the cradle of civilization where Iraq sits right now was on such a vast scale that if I didn't look at it, I was really not examining destruction of culture at all. So I started traveling there, and I've worked on documenting through my art what ISIS have done in Iraq for well, since 2015. So getting on for 10 years.
Isn't it fascinating that at school and university we're taught about wars, we study wars, but actually the element of the destruction, not just of a people or winning a physical war, but the destruction of one's cultural heritage is actually a key part of the aggressor's intention.
Yeah, absolutely right. I mean, Russia in Ukraine is the ultimate example right now, because what we're seeing is, and it's just such a great sort of way to breach this. Um, they impose their language, they remove all of the remnants of the existing culture, buildings, community related spaces like theaters, for example, town halls, destroy libraries, any repositories of historic information, such as archives. They're targeted very, very quickly as soon as an occupation begins. Um, and what they're doing is flattening the culture and separating the people from their history so that they can rebrand the nation and recreate the identity of the inhabitants in their own picture. Um, and in every sense, what Russia's doing in Ukraine mirrors dramatically what ISIS did in Iraq. And it's a system of occupation and control.
And as we know, you're very much the Nazi intention you're in Europe. Can I ask
Absolutely.
you one question before we get on to the more detail? I am genuinely fascinated by the fact that you're not the only artist in the world, and you're not the only artist in the world who recognizes this cultural destruction, this elimination of a cultural heritage as part of a war. But you're the only artist that I actually know of that has made a profession, dare I say, obsession about actually recording, not just historically, but recording within your art this destruction. And if I can you just tell us what was the stimulation? What was it that actually made you tell your family and your friends and your partner and your wife, whoever's around you, I'm off. I have to do this.
I think it was September the 11th. I realized when September the 11th happened, there was a sort of 4 or 5 month time frame between the Taliban destroying the Bamiyan Buddhas and September the 11th. And when September the 11th happened, I recognized immediately that there was a significant similarity between the Bamiyan Buddhas and 9/11. And what it was knocking down important icons of the culture of that particular place. If there had been Buddhists in Afghanistan, it would have been the beginning of a war against those people. The attacks of September the 11th, and I was in New York State, 2 hours outside the city at the time. In fact, I'd been about 2 blocks away from the Twin Towers on the Saturday beforehand. So it was all extremely close to home. Knew a lot of people who lived there, knew people who worked in the buildings. I realized that it wasn't just an attack on America. It was the way that, for example, Pearl Harbor was. It was an attack on the identity and the nature of what the United States represented in the world. And at that stage, I thought, well, if the attack is coming to me, and I can turn out of the driveway of where I'm living and I can be there in an hour and a half. It's in that closer context to where I was living and what I was doing, then I can't ignore it. How do I ignore it? I have to engage in it. I can't understand it. Infancy of the internet those days, you couldn't find in-depth information the way you can now. You can find academic papers about these things now. You couldn't in 2001. I had to understand it by making work about it, and that's how it started.
But the key thing is, it's not just the exploration, but it's then making work about it. I
Yeah,
guess that's your raison d'etre. That's your USP, that you actually you discover it firsthand, you explore it, you research it, you understand it, and then you
yeah,
make work about it. And of
yeah,
course, your exhibition, which is where we met when you had an exhibition in Cromwell Place about Alderney, the Holocaust in British soil, is represents that sort of level of work. So let's kick off. Let's go directly there.
Yeah.
When did that exploration start and how?
I was in Indianapolis in 2018, and I was in a hotel room. Um, I had been putting together an exhibition of my work in a gallery in Indianapolis, and it was late evening, and my phone started pinging frantically, and pictures were appearing into my phone from a friend of mine who I'd known for 7 or 8 years at that stage, who spent a lot of his time living on Alderney, and there were photographs of uh, fortifications on Alderney which had been very heavily bullet damaged. And they looked in many respects rather like a lot of the work I'd made about the Taliban. And so he had my interest almost immediately. And I was aware that I have a personal connection with Alderney, which is that the guns on Alderney fired at my grandfather, who was flying into the Cherbourg Peninsula the night before D-Day. He was an American pathfinder. So there was an immediate connection. And I was aware that the Alderney guns had shot at his plane. So I thought, well, I've never been to Alderney, and it's a short hop from Southampton. I'll go and look. I'll see what I can find there. If there's something interesting, I'd had some serious security difficulties, let's say, in Iraq, going to Iraq, going up to the front line, documenting what ISIS were doing in Iraq. And my wife and I were very keen that I would sort of do something a little less hazardous. Albany was a really good prospect. And when I went there, I found all sorts of extraordinary things that nobody had ever looked at before. Signatures in wet cement with names and addresses and dates of birth. And I thought, you know what, I can drill down into this, and I'm sure I'm going to find really extraordinary information, be able to make work about it. And so it went from there.
Okay, so let's set the picture, the official picture. Okay, so on the day that you started, the official picture was what? That the everybody recognized that the Channel Islands were invaded. I think from memory, I think in June, July 1940. So everybody, that's not in debate. That
Yeah,
there were casualties of that occupation, not in
yeah.
debate. How many casualties were actually recorded? What was the accepted level of, let's just use the word casualties in its broadest form?
Okay, well, there are, I think to set the picture, there are two sort of important lead academic researchers of the occupation of Alderney. One is Caroline Sturdy-Coles, who works at Staffordshire University. The other one is Gilly Carr, who works at Cambridge. Very, very well respected, highly knowledgeable. Both have written a lot of papers and books about the occupation of the Channel Islands. The number, when I first went to Alderney, the official number of people who died on Alderney was 350. Over the course of time, that's changed very significantly for a variety of reasons. But given the number of people who were understood even many years ago, decades ago, to have been transported to Alderney for the purpose of constructing concrete fortifications, there are around 150 of them all over the island. It's very, very heavily fortified for strategic reasons. There was no way that so small a number could have perished. It just didn't make sense.
Sorry, just so we've
Yeah,
got the context correct. The invasion happened in, just say
uh,
July, end of
Germans arrived on 2nd of July 1940.
2nd of July. Okay, all right. So I'm okay. Whew, I'm not too far
You,
out. Okay,
no, you had it covered.
okay.
Yeah.
Um, and of course and it ended when Germany were defeated. So
After Germany was defeated,
af-
it ended after the unconditional surrender. And if you think about the geography, if you were to look at the map of France and you look at the Cherbourg Peninsula, which juts out into the sea, Cherbourg's at the end. If you go 8 miles to the west, that's where Alderney is. So it's the most northerly Channel Island. Um,
and so when was that actually freed? When did the Germans
a couple of days after the unconditional surrender was signed.
so we're talking in
It was one of the last places in Europe to be liberated.
right. So but that liberation really didn't happen for really there was 5 years of occupation.
Correct. The invasion force went the Allied invasion force went completely around the Channel Islands. And the reason they did that, and I found the document that described this in the US National Archives, which it hadn't been seen before. It's called Operation Hadrian. It was a proposal for D-Day to go to the west of the Cherbourg Peninsula. And the estimates of casualties for D-Day were absolutely right on the nail. The estimates for casualties for Operation Hadrian, D-Day was to the east of the Cherbourg Peninsula, Hadrian was to the west. The number of people who were going to die taking back Alderney alone, let alone the other Channel Islands, before they even hit the coast of France, was the same as the entire Operation Overlord, the D-Day invasions. So it just didn't happen. There's no way that they could do it. So they literally circumnavigated the Channel Islands and they left them completely alone. All of Europe fell to the occupied, to the Allied forces, came away from the occupation. Germany was surrounded. Hitler killed himself. The war ended. The Channel Islands and Alderney were still fighting the war. A month before the unconditional surrender, the guns on Alderney were still shelling the French mainland. These were fanatics.
But going back to the number of deaths, I just find it incredible that the number of 350 was an accepted number over 5 years of occupation. Yeah. Because didn't the Germans bring in forced labor?
Thousands of people from around seven different countries. The largest by volume were Russian, Ukrainian. There were a number of Eastern European countries, Georgians, Poles, a lot of Poles. And then there's this kind of sweeping statement of North Africans. It's still not understood which nations specifically. I know about Egyptians and Libyans and Algerians. I'm sure that there would have been Moroccans. I think about the Rommel Wars, the African campaign. People were scooped up by Germany and transported as forced laborers, slave laborers. And they went to Europe and they became part of Organization Todt. Organization Todt, at its height, had under its control 1.5 million slave laborers. It was called by the Allies the biggest work, the biggest construction program since ancient Rome. How could 350 people have died? Alderney was part of the Atlantic Wall fortifications, which stretched from Sweden to Spain, but a huge percent of the poured concrete, which built the fortifications, a disproportionate volume, Alderney's only 3 miles long, went into Alderney. That takes vast manpower.
Wow. So you visited, you found things that you thought were the tip of the iceberg, if you like. You thought worth exploring.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, tip of the iceberg.
So take us through that process, please.
Well, I spoke to local people. I became friendly with a couple of people who I had been introduced to. One was a commercial fisherman. And he said, oh, you should go and look in that building over there. There's a lot of bullet damage on a wall inside there. You want to take a look at that. It's a peculiar thing. Nobody's really got to grips with that. Somebody else took me down a tunnel and I trudged down this wet, sodden tunnel with this guy thinking, where on earth are we going? There was a light railway track in the tunnel. And we came into this huge vaulted concrete lined chamber and he shone a torch down the face of a wall. And when he did that, you could see in relief, scratched into the cement, an address and a name and a date of birth. And so I thought, well, the combination of that bullet damaged wall, which I think, having looked at a lot of bullet damage in the past, is nothing to do with attacking or defending. I think that's something far more sinister. And I'm going to find people to come and look at it and verify. And this signature of this man, I'm going to find out who he is. I'm going to find out his whole life story. And I have found out an absurd volume of information about the fellow. And it became about unfolding the physical remnants of the German occupation and telling the human story of what that meant and what it portrayed, what it explained and described.
And what did this gentleman whose life story you discovered, what did that tell you about what happened in Alderney between 1940 and 1945?
Well, he's a fascinating guy. What it told me ultimately is that huge quantities of people from all over Western Russia, in particular, he was a Russian guy, were shipped off into labor camps, concentration camps, which all had within their structure sub-camps. So, for example, this fellow, his name was Vasily Vasilyevich Kostin. And the inscription, I'll just tell you what it said very briefly. It said, Arakskaya Street 11. Stalingrad, his name in full, Kostin Vasily Vasilyevich with 2 initial V's, date of birth and date of the inscription. From all of that, I could find out who he was. And the more of these individuals whose names appeared around the island scratched into the cement, and there were quite a number of them, this one had more information than anyone else could really find out who this guy was because of the date of birth. I realized that, of course, these people had lives, they had families, they had careers, they had a home, they had children, you know, they were you and me, you know, and they were grabbed by, in this instance, the Soviet system, which said, you're now part of the military, you're signed up, sign this piece of paper, give us all your details. That meant I could find him, pack the guy off. Weeks later, he's captured by the Germans.
Where did they send him off to? Do you know?
Yes. So let me go back a tiny bit. I believe that he was a bricklayer or a mason. And he moved when he was in his teens to Stalingrad and he became a chauffeur. So he went up in the world a bit, you know, got married, had 2 children, pressed into the military. He was captured just to the north of Stalingrad and pressed into the slave labor system. And he goes off to Neuengamme concentration camp. And then he's fielded out by Neuengamme to a labor camp, which is it's about an hour away from Neuengamme, where he works in a factory. And I've seen his factory time card, which he has to write all the information, sign it off and everything. It's impossible to know what he's doing there. He was calling himself a chauffeur, but he realized he's not going to survive as a chauffeur. So he started calling himself a maurer, a wall builder or mason. And he obviously had that skill because he's put to work doing that immediately and he survives. So then he goes back through Neuengamme and disappears, but then resurfaces on Alderney. After his time on Alderney, he disappears again until he's arrested by the Soviets. And it took 2 years searching archives to find out in between Alderney and his arrest, very close to Berlin by the Russians, he had survived the encroachment of the Allies.
How did he escape from Alderney under Nazi regime to Berlin? Or do you think he was sent from Alderney by the Nazis to Germany?
Yes, he didn't escape. 6 people escaped. There are 3 accounts of escapes, but he didn't escape. A lot of them were cycled back out. When they became very weak, they would be sent back out, fresh workers would be brought in. I think the reason was that the top hierarchy of the Nazi system, Hitler and Himmler, had a personal interest in making sure that the development of the fortifications on Alderney happened at great speed. And very weak workers couldn't do that. So quantities of large quantities of slave workers were continually brought in. That meant that quantities of weak workers had to be moved out. So he cycled back into a work system somewhere else. When the Soviets captured Soviet soldiers or Russian-speaking soldiers, or even ultimately individuals who came from what was then occupied, an area of Eastern Europe that was occupied by the Soviets, they would be confronted by the Soviets, and the Soviets would say to them, "You're alive. That means that you didn't fight to the death. Therefore, you're a traitor. So now you go to the Gulag." So I found a piece of paper that said that he'd been into a Gulag, what they call a filtration camp, to kind of work into the Gulag prison system after the fall of Berlin. So he's under control of Russians. And it was called Feodosia 299. It was in Crimea. They took him to Crimea and he went into the Gulag system there. So I went to the Gulag museum staff, the head archivist, and said, Theodosia 299, tell me about it, anything at all. Where do you think this guy would have ended up? What would have become of him? And they said, well, Theodosia 299, thank you for telling us about it. We didn't know about it. It's definitely a filtration camp. He vanished into the system like so many hundreds of thousands, if not millions, and we don't know what became of him. That's the end of the story, really. But it's just one grain of sand in a very big pile, one individual who found a way to survive, ultimately only to end up in the gulag.
Let's go back because these stories are so fascinating, but they're not necessarily key to all this. So you're now in Alderney. You've discovered you've gone down the tunnels. You've seen the walls. You know your nose is twitching. You just know that there's a bigger story here that's not been told. How do you start? How do you actually plan this strategy out in terms of not really knowing where you want to go, except you know that it's a bigger story, but you don't know what it is, you don't know where it is, or why it is, or even how it was.
Yeah.
What was your thought process? How did you actually start to? Because one man, no matter how enterprising, it's a hell of a challenge for one man.
Oh yeah, big time. I mean, I was acutely aware of that. I realized very quickly that I needed professional researchers who I could send out into archives, who could procure information for me and help me patch together stories. So, for example, Costin was one. There were about 10 different elements, remnants of the German occupation on Alderney, which I wrote a list of. And I thought, what do I realistically think that will tell a human story here? The execution wall was one, Costin was another, there were a few others. And I made a short list and I started to think about who could I go to, for example, to try and unfold the story of Costin. Who was this man, you know? So I started making a few phone calls, and when I found that leads came very quickly, I'd follow those. The rest slowly fell by the wayside. And I thought, well, maybe in the future I can look into those. But I ended up with a core of about 6 different stories that I wanted to unfold to the greatest degree possible. And the researchers I went to were either professional researchers who were specialists in particular archives or specialists in a particular niche field of World War II or Soviet history and knew exactly where to go. And so I kind of set them loose. None of them asked me for money. Well, one fellow in Washington did to trawl the US State Archive, US National Archive. But the rest just said, this is so amazing. I'm going to find out all. Oh, no, you don't need to pay me. I'm going to get to grips with this, and then a relationship comes into life and goes from there.
Forgive me for interrupting, but how did you know who to find, or did you send word out and see who responds, or I mean,
Megaphone out of the window.
Yeah,
I
yeah,
mean, for example, I got hold of the Bodleian Library in Oxford, and I
yeah.
said, look, do you know any professional researchers who can help me to try to unfold the story of a guy who was in the Soviet army? And they said, oh yes, there's this fellow Bruce Menning, and he lives in the middle of the cornfields in Idaho with his Russian wife. He doesn't speak a word of English, and he helped put together the Modern Russian History Library at the Bodleian. He's your guy. Of all of the people in the world who you want to talk to, you want to talk to that guy. And there were several leads like that, and I found these extraordinary people, and they just off they went. I had to kind of restrain them at various different stages, and what we really want is a photo of this guy. Don't worry about what his wife got up to. Let's focus on him. That's interesting, but let's try and stay on target. What we need is a photo of this guy. There was a lot of conversation like that.
Quite extraordinary. And so these researchers came through and they came up trumps and gave you lots of leads, probably more leads you could possibly follow. So
Yeah.
how did you decide which leads you were going to follow that was going to take you to your objective? Had you by this stage identified that what it is that you want to really find out and either prove or disprove, or was it still part of a journey to an unknown end?
Well, a couple of the subjects that I decided to work on were very expansive from the start. So, for example, Serge Klaasfeld, who lives in Paris, gave me a list of what he said was 700 Jews who were deported to Alderney. I asked him, how is it possible that only 8 Jewish people died on Alderney in 5 years of occupation? I'm not buying it. And he said, well, I'm saying this in my very broken French. And he said, well, I've got a list of 700 Jews who were transported to Alderney. And so he gave it to me. And with the help of a Cambridge humanities student who had just graduated, we found the addresses of 425 original addresses, 425 of these people. And we wrote 425 letters. And 6 people replied. I mean, when I started putting out feelers and I started to get information back, those are the ones that I followed. So the Klaasfeld list was one.
So 700. So the Jewish community increased substantially as a result of the Nazi occupation. It may also have shrunk substantially.
It shrunk very dramatically. Yeah. But I mean, very recently I made a trip to Paris with a film crew, and we interviewed 3 families, the descendants, the children of these prisoners, and they told us extraordinary things. It continues to unfold.
And I go back to where we started. That the starting point was that there was a Nazi occupation of the Channel Islands for 5 years, 5 years in Alderney, and 350 people murdered essentially. What stage did you decide that the 350 was a sham?
Well, I started digging around to try to get information out of the Russian state archives about Kostin, about this man who wrote the inscription.
And is that I'm asking for personal reasons. I have a very good friend of mine called Kostin. Is that a C or a K?
K.
K. All right.
Yeah.
He's in the clear. He's a C.
Oh, okay. Well, I mean, just out of a sheer interest, there were 17 Vasily Vasilyevich Kostins who were arrested by the Germans and went into the slave labor system. So I had to whittle it down and figure out slowly through a process of elimination which one he was, and then do the research. Anyway, I was talking to the Russian, to answer your question, I was talking to the Russian State Archives. This is before the Ukraine invasion. I'm talking to the Russian State Archives, and the man who I was speaking to, is the head archivist, started telling me, look, you're going to have a hard time finding information about this guy. He's just one needle in a haystack. As a backup, is there anything else that you'd like, just in case we don't get anywhere with this? And I said, well, I'd really love a copy of the Russian case for prosecution of Germans on Alderney. And he said, oh yeah, that was written by, and I said, General Vasilov. He said, that's right, when he was a colonel. So I asked for that, and he said, yes, we'll give that to you. That's never been seen in the UK. So it took a long time to get the money to Russia, because it's hard to send money to a Russian government department.
You had to pay for this.
I had to pay for it, yeah, by the page. It was about, I think it was about £125 or something like that. And the irony of it was that he was billing me for the wrong document, and he knew he was going to give me the wrong document. The billing was for the number of pages of the document he ultimately sent me, which was not what I asked for. What he sent me was the UK's case for prosecution of Germans on Alderney, which I shared with the historian.
Hang on. Sorry. The UK case for the prosecution of the Germans in Alderney.
Yeah.
What's this? I mean, I'm not aware of this.
Well, apparently that was at the time a classified document. It's known as the Panchev report. It was written by a man who worked for military intelligence, who came to Alderney immediately after the occupation of the island. He was sent to write a detailed intelligence report on what had happened on the island, whether local people, most 99% of whom were evacuated before the Germans arrived, and slave laborers had been killed or brutalized or tortured on the island, and to write a full report, no holds barred. And that was then handed over to the British government so they could decide whether to prosecute these Germans, who at the time had been arrested and were being held in what's known as the London Cage, which is
So,
a prison system.
so the British arrested, so the British liberated the Channel Islands. The British arrested the Nazis that were on it.
Yeah,
The British sent a member of the intelligence service to do a full report, build a case to prosecute,
yeah.
and
And then they didn't prosecute, which is a very peculiar thing. It's an anomaly. They signed the treaty to carry out war crimes trials on the native soil of the country where crimes were committed. They had the Germans, they knew what they'd done, but politicians being politicians, they decided that this was going to get extremely ugly. There were 2 concentration camps on Alderney. They didn't want to talk about that. You know, politicians naturally play up the good and play down the bad. And they didn't want the story, which was newsreels on every cinema in the world, Auschwitz, Dachau, Buchenwald, etc., to be broadcast in the UK. This is the concentration camp on Alderney, on British soil. They didn't want it. And they didn't know where the line would be drawn, I'm very sure of this, between prosecuting Germans on the other Channel Islands, Guernsey, Jersey, and Sark, because the Germans inevitably were going to hand over lists of locals who were British, who had collaborated or cooperated, is also a very good way of thinking of it. If you cooperate, you collaborate. So if you own a shop, the German comes in, you sell them a bar of chocolate. Have you collaborated? That's arguable. So if the Germans were to hand over lists of people who cooperated, how many hundreds of Brits were going to have to be prosecuted? So the UK government basically just said to the Russians, we've got this document which says a lot of Russians died on Alderney. Would you like it? The Russians said yes. They took the document. They wrote their own report that was written by this fellow, Pat Basilov. And then they went back to the British, according to a fellow called Solomon Steckel, who got the minutes of cabinet meetings as this was unfolding, went back to the British and said, give us these Germans, we're going to prosecute them, which means, you know, the kind of between the lines there is, we're going to take them out the back and shoot them.
Yeah, and did they?
No, because the British said, I'm sorry, there's been sort of awful clerical error, and we've released them. And they, you know, they're back on the continent now, but we're going to help you find them. And they didn't. And they didn't get prosecuted.
Okay, so
but they drew their German war pensions.
they drew the German war pensions, so they lived happily ever after.
Sadly.
Okay, again, I'm trying. The temptation to keep going down these avenues is almost irresistible, but
there are many. Yeah,
trying hard not to. Just out of interest, how many concentration camps? First of all, were they called concentration camps, and how many on the other Channel Islands?
Well, for example, when the SS took over Lager Sylt, which is at the far southwestern corner of Alderney, it became a concentration camp as opposed to simply a labor camp. And there are various definitions. I have to tell you that that is not my area of detailed knowledge. So I'm not going to try to explain the difference between a labor camp and a concentration camp, but there are legal definitions that
okay, but let's call them labor stroke concentration camps. Let's say camps under the supervision of the Nazis.
Of the SS in particular, yeah. But there's an important point to be drawn here. These camps were not death camps. Okay, people weren't sent there to be killed. They were sent there to work.
Yeah. But do you know how many there were on the other islands, in the total of the Channel Islands?
Slave laborers? No, I don't know.
Or slave labor camps?
Many. I mean, it's very difficult actually to define exactly how many labor camps there were on Alderney. In theory, there were 4 major camps, but it's also now known that there were sub-camps, smaller camps. And so what we understand was going on was that by and large, a lot of the laborers in these camps were doing work projects in the immediate vicinity of where they were living in these camps. So for example, on the north coast of Alderney, there was a camp called Helgoland. And in Helgoland, The slave laborers in the first half of the war were predominantly Jewish, and they worked in the immediate vicinity building concrete fortifications. And we know that those concrete fortifications were built by the inhabitants of Helgoland because one of them scratched a Star of David into the wooden shuttering against which concrete was poured, and it's known to be there. So once those fortifications exist and they're visible on aerial photographs, overflight British airplanes took photographs, the camp is packed up and moved east to the other end of the island, and that became Norderney camp. And in 1949, France in courtrooms defined, or in a courtroom, defined Norderney as a concentration camp. So that's the second concentration camp on the island.
Okay, so just forgive me for pushing it, just as much
Yep.
for my interest as our guest's interest.
Sure.
But I didn't know there was any concentration camps, or I mean, I sort of half knew there were labor camps. But the invasion of the Channel Islands is really it's an under-communicated event. We're so fixated with what happened in Central Europe.
Yeah.
But have you any idea of how many imported forced labor there was in the Channel Islands in total?
I mean, it was definitely in the thousands. I mean, for example, you asked a very interesting question a little bit earlier. You know, where did the numbers change? You know, what caused you to believe that the numbers changed? Well, that Panchev report, which came from the Russian State Archive, it ended up being published in Sunday Times, but there was a single sentence. They missed a trick. The single sentence in there that changed everything, in my opinion, was a sentence which said 2,000 Russians came to the island in the autumn of this year, and then in the spring of the following year, only 225 were still alive. Well, that's a British military intelligence document. So 350 deaths means nothing when British military intelligence are stating these very particular numbers. We add that to the 350, you get 2,000.
That's only the Russians. You said earlier on, correct me if I'm wrong, that
Yep.
to your knowledge, there was at least 7 countries of nationalities, ethnicity in terms of forced labor. So if there was 1,750 Russians that had gone missing from the arithmetic, what about
now you're getting the picture. The North Africans, for example, can't account for them. We don't know how many there were. We don't know who they were. We don't know how many died, how many survived. The paperwork doesn't exist. Bear something in mind, right? Through the timeline of the Second World War, you get to D-Day, and then between D-Day and the end of the war, we've got 10 months. Alderney and the other Channel Islands are surrounded by air, sea, and land. They can't do anything. They can't refuel. They can't receive new supplies. They managed to scramble a lot of prisoners out very quickly from Alderney, but that was one of the last things that they did that was of significance by volumes, right? All the construction work was finished at that stage, but they couldn't resupply, so they had no fuel. So they tore down all the buildings and used it as fuel. The first thing that they were going to burn was their paperwork because they knew they were surrounded. They laid a telegraph cable between Guernsey and Alderney, which I found out about recently, translating a terrible sort of German handwritten document. And that meant that they knew exactly what was going on. They knew the moment they hit to kill themselves. So they were getting rid of all of their paperwork. They got rid of all of the wood on the island because they had no fuel. There was nothing left at the end, let alone information. The Germans had 10 months to get their story straight and make it look like they were really being decent people on the island. Oh, so unfortunate, small number five. You know.
Am I just something's come through into my head, to my
Yeah.
foggy memory? Is there not a line that Hitler asked for the residents of the Channel Islands to be treated well? Am I imagining this?
You know, the only place that I'm aware that there was a policy of treating people in a fairly civil way, at least for a while, was the Netherlands. I've not heard that about the Channel Islands, but it doesn't mean it didn't exist.
Had to be treated with tact and courtesy and all this sort of thing. You know, not that they did, but
it's possible. It's possible.
It's floating in. You'll forgive me. Okay. We must get back to the art because otherwise we'll spend 3 days talking about your historical revelations. So what have you done in terms of art? How have you recreated this uh, not just a memorial, but it's an artistic reflection and
Yeah.
representation of what went on. Please tell us, share with us.
Well, the first time I visited Alderney, I was struck by the beauty of the island. It is extraordinarily beautiful. If anybody listening has never been to Alderney and they want a cheap holiday, jump on a plane and go from Southampton. It takes 40 minutes. The beaches are golden coloured. The sea is turquoise. There are hills, rolling hills, cliffs. It's stunning. There are acres and acres of wildflowers all over the island. People go to Alderney to look at the wild, to walk and look at the wildflowers. And of course, right underneath this beautiful landscape is this very dark story. So I wanted the work to contrast the two. So the way that I did that was I met somebody on the island who had found some German artillery, some abandoned artillery. People find things on the island constantly. And this fellow had found some artillery, and he was a military guy, and he chose, I think this is terribly dangerous, but and probably completely illegal, but he chose to open up the artillery to decommission it, and he removed the cordite, which he burned for me, and he handed it over to me because I asked for it, because I thought, well, I'm going to use that as printing ink, and I'm going to print the text of documents that I found, portraits of the people, and tell the story through these pictures, but I'm going to print them on top of very beautiful colored backgrounds, which I'm going to take with my phone, of wildflowers, the turquoise ocean, the blue sky, the yellow sand, foliage changing color in the autumn, and all that sort of thing. And so they look sort of like Warhols, but they've obviously got much more sort of weight to them because there are these British government documents, German documents, antique photographs, transport lists, for example. And so most of the work is groups of these prints put together, their frames touching each other to form a grid. And then there are a few molds which I made of, for example, Costin's inscription. And I molded the 4.5-meter long execution wall, which is in a Victorian fort on the beach on the north shore of the island.
Now, where are these works? Where, because these are historically important, because you've unlike most people who will take what we know as being gospel and then create some historic artworks to it. You've done both sides of this coin. Where are these works? Where can they be seen? Because you have a
Well,
work. Am I
well,
correct? You have a work in the B&A,
I have a work in the V&A. Yeah, that's an ISIS-related work.
right?
I have a work on permanent display in the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford,
Right.
at the back of the Middle East room. That's also an ISIS-related work. On David, on your Ben Uri website, there's the online exhibition of the work,
Yes.
so people can find it on the Ben Uri website or on my website. And each of the works has a QR code in the corner. So you can put your phone in front of the QR code and listen to a little bit of narration to describe what the work of art is.
And there's also a film. Am I
Yes, in
correct?
fact, it's going to be a couple of films very shortly. There's a
Tell us.
short film, and there's a link to the short film on my website. It was made by a Brazilian fellow who's a burgeoning and very skilled and gifted, actually, filmmaker. His name's Jose Lins, and it's about half an hour long, and it follows me around on Alderney. We went down some very literally peculiar sort of rabbit holes, dug out underground storage chambers and things like this. And then he covers the exhibition and shows the works at the end.
And where have these works been exhibited? Where have you exhibited? Because you're talking about Minneapolis,
Um, well,
Indianapolis.
Indianapolis was a different project. That was an ISIS-related project.
Yeah.
There's a possibility that the works will be shown in the Channel Islands in the summer this year. Hopefully, fingers crossed. If everything goes well, there's some construction work which has to be completed in the building where they hopefully will go to. And then there's also a conversation about them traveling to the University of Nebraska in Omaha, And the University of Nebraska in Omaha has a Holocaust and Genocide Learning Center. And so they're very keen to do periodically to do exhibitions which relate to that field of education. And so we're in conversation about the exhibition traveling there. That would be in the end of next year.
Now, before we open it up to our guests to ask questions, and please do put them in the chat and I will represent you. I also understand that Lord Pickles has created, in his role, has created some sort of UK commission for investigating this. Tell us more, please.
So in the summer last year, I think in part the kind of the finding of the Panchef report and the publishing of it a couple of years ago, and then the exhibition and a bit of a shockwave in the press. There has been a lot of Alderney related press coverage in recent years, and a lot of it speculates about the number of people who died on the island. I won't try to fix a figure to it because it's just not my area of knowledge or expertise. But there's been huge speculation, and Lord Pickles, who is the chair of the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance for the UK, said, okay, let's open this up, have an official inquiry, government-led inquiry, and try to determine once and for all what happened and what the numbers are. I hope that he can come up with a number, but I fear it's going to be extremely difficult, in part, in my opinion, because hundreds of millions of documents exist in archives but have not yet been scanned, especially in the United States, the US National Archives. The more material they scan, the more people find out about Alderney and its occupation and what went on. So I think given another 10, 15, maybe 20 years, there'll be even more information and numbers of people as well. So it's a very honorable attempt to, take a stab at this thing and define it properly. But it's a real challenge.
Question has come in, if I can represent it. To what extent do you think the local Alderney population know or knew or suspect the reality of the Nazi occupation? Very good question.
In my experience, the inhabitants of Alderney who have retired there and who want to live a quiet life there generally don't really want to have to deal with this, by and large. Some of them, it's not true at all, and they're very happy to understand what went on. But you have to understand that the landscape, the island's only 3 miles long, and the landscape is completely splattered with these serious concrete fortifications. So you can't live on the island and not be acutely aware of its history, of this occupation history. The younger generations definitely want to know. I think I'm yet to meet one, say, I'm 47 years old. I've not met anyone on the island, say 50 or younger, who doesn't want to get to grips with this and understand it fully, and ultimately can then just kind of let it be and get on with not having to think about it relentlessly because the history is known. And I think that's very important actually for people on the island, by and large.
What is the population of Alderney, just out of interest?
I understand it's around about 2,500.
2,500, okay.
Yeah.
One question, will the film be accessible to the public? Could you post your website, please?
Absolutely, yes. There's a link to the film. It's on Vimeo. And perhaps, David, it would be a nice thing for you to have on Ben Uri as well. Perhaps I'll give you the link and, we can do that.
Yeah, yeah. Can you type it? I don't know whether you can technically type it onto the chat line so that people can see it.
Well, I'll have to go away. It's going to take me a bit of maneuvering because I have to go away from this page.
Okay, no, don't worry. So we'll
if you check into, perhaps, David, if we have people check into the website in a couple of days.
Yeah, if you, what I'll do is, I'm just trying to think because we're all away next week at the International Art Historians Conference in Bristol University. We're presenting 2 days out of the 3, so we're literally moved Ben Uri to Bristol.
Let me see if I can do this while we're talking. If you feel like asking another question, fire away.
Okay. How close are you to not completing but to fulfilling the objective of Alderney? And out of the 30 wars that are currently going on in the world today,
Yeah.
30 wars. Which one are you thinking about addressing next?
Well, how close am I to completing what I would like to? Well, let's think of it this way. My main focus at the moment is two things relating to Alderney. I would very much like to find a photograph of Costin so that he becomes a real person. That's my main objective related to Costin. In relation to this very extensive list from Serge Klarsfeld, around about 350 approximately letters bounced back by the French from the French postal service. So I know that a lot of people are never going to reply. That leaves a very small number of people who I know haven't responded, which makes me think perhaps they've received the letters. I'm very tempted to go and knock on a couple of people's doors. Two people in particular have responded but haven't given me anything solid, but they know that I'm here. I know that they're there, and I'm trying to meet them in the middle. Once I can do that and connect their biographies of their relative who was imprisoned with a photograph of that person, then I feel like I've done what I can with Alderney. And I expect most likely that I will look at Ukraine next. And I have a very specific idea of what I want to look at in that respect. So I'm building up to that.
I'm just typing in your website, which is pierssecunda.com.
I just sent you a link.
Ah, okay. I haven't got that. You sent it to me or onto the
Sent it to
on
the iCloud email. Do you have that?
hold on one second. I'm just seeing whether I can find your link to your. Sorry, really, I haven't got it yet. I do now. Okay, fine.
No.
So please, everybody, any more questions whilst I'm typing this out, please? Vimeo.com/81882959. Okay. So I'll give everybody a few minutes to note that down. Okay. Any other questions from our guests who have all stayed the course? So that's an indication of how interesting and engaging this interview has been. Okay. Well, if there are no more questions, we're spot on time at 7:30, and I'm very keenly aware that it is Easter Monday and it's a public holiday, and we've taken up your time. But it was an absolute privilege to discuss with you again, but this time in public, your career, your history, and the work that you're doing, which is just so important. It's very easy to forget that you are a distinguished member of the artist fraternity, given all the work that you do. But the combination of your research and your passion and obsession and your art making, it makes you a very special person. And thank you for being here.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We wish you everybody a very good evening. Please keep the 10th of April free. That will be the opening of our next exhibition, Us, From There to Here, which, guess what, continues to focus on our main and sole focus of the immigrant, Jewish and refugee contribution to British visual culture since 1900. Thank you so much, everybody. Stay safe and well. Thank you again, Piers.
You're very welcome. Take care, everybody. Bye-bye.